counts of people who literally going to bed at 6 o'clock because there's nothing else you can do. It's pitch dark. Look at satellite photographs of North Korea at night. You can see China on the one side, South Korea on the other, and there's black space in between.
How do we understand North Korea? The authoritarian socialist regime has long been isolated from the rest of the world. Many refer to it as the Hermit nation. Joining me to discuss is Terence Corrigan of the Institute of Race Relations. He's written a series of articles on North Korea on their website newsy.co.za. We'll link to those in the description. Terence, welcome back to the CRA channel. Could you take us through some of the points you made in your articles about the nature of the regime in North Korea?
North Korea, in a sense, can't be understood unless you put aside a lot of your preconceptions about what constitutes a society. When trying to understand something new, an analogy is often helpful. This is like that. And frankly, there's nothing in the world that really matches North Korea geopolitically. This is a country that had that had a massive famine in the 1990s that killed somewhere between a few 100,000 and a few million people. We don't know those numbers. We don't know what the birthday of the head of state is. This is a country that doesn't really have internet access to the outside world, but it has nuclear weapons. It's Winston Churchill referred to Russia or the Soviet Union as this riddle wrapped in an enigma inside a question, or however the formula went. But he also said we can trust Russia to act in its own interests. That at least could be discerned. We just don't really understand. It's almost impossible for an outsider to understand what goes on in the North Korean psyche. You mentioned the Hermit Kingdom. Now, this actually goes back to the 19th century. China, Japan were also quite insular societies in the world as it was developing then, but they were kind of forced open. The Korean Peninsula managed to remain almost sealed off even from that process, and it was kind of dragged into the modern world through the Japanese Empire. Underwent a very harsh Japanese experience of colonialism under the Japanese, which is a source of great tension between South Korea and Japan, and obviously North Korea. Even though South Korea and Japan have a somewhat cooperative relationship now, it was divided by the superpowers, much as Europe or later Indochina was, and for a long time it was kind of regarded as another Marxist state, semi-developing. Its economy grew quite rapidly through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Though a lot of that was war reconstruction. They received a lot of support from the Soviet Union. But there's this kind of fusion of Stalinist Marxism and what has been called the least humane elements of Confucianism.
Enjoying this analysis? Click here to sign up for our 30-day free trial for more content from the CIA.
More so than any other country in the world, it is isolated. As I say, there's internet access is virtually unavailable to anyone apart from very, very trusted people within the regime. Ideological conformity is demanded, and indoctrination is pervasive. People who've been to North Korea can talk about how there are no cultural reference points between what you might see elsewhere in the world, even in repressive societies. You can watch cable television in China. Okay, the government censors it and whatever, but there is still sort of enough to connect you. The Chinese do know, for instance, that South Korea is a highly developed society. This is not the view that people in North Korea have. They believe everyone in South Korea is living below the breadline. This is a kind of reality that's been that's been constructed, all really with one almost. I hesitate to use the term monarchical, more kind of deified dynasty that sits on the top, the Kims. There is an interesting office in the North Korean constitution, the eternal leader. That's probably the only state in the world that has a dead person as its leader. That's the independence icon Kim Il Sung. So what you have is a very rapidly developing region of the world. You know, China, South Korea, Japan, wealthy countries, the United States has security guarantees, and this state that is almost an information black hole, but a particularly dangerous one because there is a hugely assertive and aggressive ideology that drives it. How do you respond to that? Well, that's the big question.
So, Terence, what about the North Korean relationship with the region more broadly and the rest of the world? How does it behave on the international stage?
You know, the way that North Korea sort of sees itself and has trained its people to see itself is that North Korea is kind of the best society ever with the best social system. And this is genuinely believed as far as we can tell from the little information we have, and often this comes from accounts of defectors, that North Korea's juche system, which is essentially a type of self-reliance, and its internal social order, which ranks people according to their political reliability. And this goes into, you know, did you have a second cousin who was a Christian, for instance, which gives you what they call very bad songbon and puts you right at the bottom of the social pyramid. This is seen by many North Koreans as the pinnacle of social evolution. So it's an idea that you know, we have what the world wants now. North Korea was suspicious of the Soviet Union because they felt that it didn't bail them out sufficiently during the Korean War, whereas the Americans sent their army to defend their client state. The Chinese sent troops to North Korea's aid, but China and Korea have a very complicated historical relationship. One shouldn't assume that Marxism is even the dominant ideological driver. This sense of Korean exceptionalism. There's been a book written about called The Cleanest Race, which you know, suggests that there's this enormous national chauvinism. When North Korea interacts with the outside world, it has to be on terms that do not influence its own internal arrangements. So, for instance, it actually has a very big footprint in Southern Africa, not in South Africa, but Zimbabwe, Namibia. The History Museum in Windhoek, for instance, is a North Korean structure. In Senegal, there's this big statue celebrating, you know, Africa revitalized, which apparently cost in North Korea. They send work crews to do things like lumbering in Siberia, but a little North Korea is created around them. You still have to do your indoctrination. You don't get to interact with the locals. Basically, you know, as much North Korea follows a North Korean around. Kim Jong-un was educated in Switzerland, but also in a way that his mind has created this little North Korea in the Alpine region around him, so that he could get an academic education, but hopefully none of the other stuff would rub off. There's just no comparison for that. North Korea, to answer your broader question, it is a severely economically retarded state. And it's often had to sort of float itself with outright criminality. It doesn't appear to be doing that anymore, but certainly during the 1990s, heroin, for instance, was being transported on official shipping. There were diplomats who were involved in things like wildlife smuggling. In fact, South Africa expelled a North Korean diplomat a couple of years ago because of being caught with rhino oil. That's part of it, and there are certainly criminal networks that grew out of that, which seems to operate with some sort of, at least, tacit cooperation. But for the most part, as long as it can draw in enough resources to keep a very small elite happy, and to perhaps keep the lid on dissent for most of the population, which is a very low bar, just enough rice and sort of kimchi to eat, because people just don't have a point of comparison. They can use their prison camps, for instance, to mine coal, which they sell for hard currency. You know, it's unpredictable and almost uninfluenceable.
Terence, in your articles, you also discussed the prospects for reform in Korea. And obviously, it's very difficult to ascertain how robust the regime is. But could there be the emergence of market-based commerce, which could lay the foundations for a kind of a broader civil society movement, or could the regime break down in an unexpected way?
Well, as to the first question, that's a lot of scholars have speculated about this. Certainly in the 1990s, it kind of accepted the existence of markets. And I think there's also something to understand about North Korea. It's not a static society. But what appears to have happened is that with people starving in large numbers, it kind of accepted the inevitability and then tried to retrospectively control it. The markets that exist, and there's several hundred of them that are kind of state approved or state tolerated. They generally sell kind of very low level stuff. It's food stuff, some electronics or whatever. Some of it brought or smuggled in. Often, North Korea is also has a big corruption issue, a lot of which enables this business to carry on. But think about that more as sort of survivalist enterprises. The regime apparently restricts certain people, who can work in these markets. They generally tend to be women of a certain age, because others have to be engaged in other sort of activities. Women have a particular status in North Korean society. So, while there are, I'm not going to even use the term green shoots. I'm going to say there are perhaps seeds there. We are still, several removes away from any kind of independent organization. More extensive private business or joint ventures or whatever, those are strictly entrusted to people with good songbun. In other words, people who have a vested interest in keeping the state moving. So a question I put to one scholar: okay, perhaps there's some influences that might come in. Let's say not from South Korea, not from the West, but Chinese businessmen who operate there. And he said, well, yeah, possibly, but that Chinese businessman will fly into North Korea, deal with one or two people with minders. These people all have a vested interest in keeping the system working, and then he flies back. This isn't like Hungary in the 1980s. We had Austrian tourists going, and people could sit and chat about, think this would be great if we could just get rid of the Russians. You just don't have that sort of opening. The other thing is that the North Korean government can change tack very, very rapidly. So whereas in the 1990s they kind of accepted the existence of markets, at their party congress a few months ago, they reasserted the importance of the state as the lead element. The other problem for social organization, of course, is the demands that the government makes on your time. If you are not a member of the Korean Workers' Party, which very, very few people are, this is kind of let's say your elite vanguard, you have to be a member of some mass organization. And that means, you have to take part in its activities, and these can literally chew up your time. As for, doing stuff in the evening, remember that, they have electricity outages. There's counts of people who literally going to bed at 6 o'clock because there's nothing else you can do. It's pitch dark. Look at satellite photographs of North Korea at night. You can see China on the one side, South Korea on the other, and there's black space in between. You can't move around freely. To live in Pyongyang, which would be your kind of metropolis where this sort of thing might happen, well, you have to be regime acceptable. So yes, you have to have good songbon to be there, and that anybody who ends up there kind of has a vested interest in keeping the system rolling. So that sort of thing. If there is a prospect of this developing, this is, as I say, stages removed. Could it collapse? In the 1990s, as I say, they had this apocalyptic famine, and the regime survived. Where people have very little sense of what is happening outside and what the alternatives are, you stick with what you know. I mean, it's about destroying aspirations. And very interesting, a lot of defectors, now these are people who've made the leap and left, often gone to South Korea, where they can live in, where they're living in a sort of related culture, often feel a very deep sense of shame and remorse that, you know, was this ethical? Did they do the right thing? You know, and as I say, these are people who've actually made that leap. All the evidence from defectors that we have, that actually the regime has a certain legitimacy, if only because of the lack of alternatives, you know, available within the mental space.
Terence Corrigan, thanks very much for joining us on the Center for Risk Analysis channel. My name is David Ansara. If you like this content, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Also check out the link in the description below to our 30-day free trial. Until next time, take care.